Right, Morena everyone, and hi to this meeting of the Climate Change Subcommittee. Do we have any apologies? I'm sorry, I should say welcome Neil as our guest today. No apologies. Any declarations of interest? None of those, and no public forum that I'm aware of. So the minutes of the last meeting. The 7th of April. And we'd like to move there. I'll move. Thank you, Eric, and seconded by Lyndall. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. That's carried. Right, we'll go on to item 1. And we've got a PowerPoint presentation for that.
Morena Koto. I think everybody knows Neil, who has been helping us out with the organisational greenhouse gas baseline. Just got a brief presentation to run through together to talk through the organisational baseline report, which has been quite a significant milestone for that to be completed. And it's also being verified by an external party now as well. So just as a bit of a recap to start with, in terms of where this came from, when we're talking about climate change, we're quite often talking about the two sides of the conversation in terms of adaptation and emission reduction. And this particular project sits over to the right of that diagram there in terms of the internal work that we need to do to get ourselves on track, get this organisation on track to measure and start reducing our own emissions, do our own emissions reductions. So that's the key part of the discussion today. Why are we doing it? Because we want to understand our own impact. We need to understand our own emission sources. We need to prioritise our own emissions reduction activity. And all of this is making sure that we're doing our bit to work towards our net zero goal that we agreed to earlier this year for greenhouse gases 2050. And that we also want to be walking the talk in this space as much as possible. But this is a start of a long-term learning journey. So I'll hand over to Neil, who is going to take us through how we've got to where we're at today.
Thank you. So council have seen this diagram before, but just to reset where we're at on the journey in terms of doing our baseline reporting. The steps are defining your boundaries, and these are all set out within the report, defining the boundaries, then define your emission sources, then you work through, you identify the emission factors, build your inventory, gather the data, calculate what your baseline is. In a perfect world, as we did, you get it verified, and then you report, and that's where we sit today. And then you start and do the whole thing all over again. So, for council, our number, things flick over. Measurement. Council's measurements.
Probably somebody that's written sorted.
Right. Council's, there's something funny going on, but we'll carry on. So council's total greenhouse gas measurement for the for that baseline year is 2,116 metric tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions.
Just before you carry on now, was that echoing fixed now? It sounded reasonable. Better. Okay.
Yeah.
So we have separated that that baseline total between business as usual type activity and capital and extraordinary project type activity. Now, we understand that council will continue to have capital and extraordinary projects, but they will be lumpy by nature in terms of their size and their timing. So we think it's important for us understanding what our baseline is and what we can do to reduce our baseline to separate it into those two.
Sorry to interrupt again, Neil. I think we've got Dean outside wanting to come in, maybe. I'm not sure whether he can come in or not. Okay, all right. Thank you. Sorry, Neil. Yeah, carry on, please.
So this here is the, and so we'll talk to the report shortly, but before we get into the report, I thought it's useful just to touch on the result of the verification process. And so this is us setting out. So the categories 1, 2, 3, 4 are the ISO categories. You'll note in the report that we've used subcategories. That's purely for our own purpose of managing and reporting and what have you. So for us, that sets out under the respective categories what our emissions are on, per tonnes by CO2 equivalent. And then it also, that's the Toitu's verification there is their level of verification as to whether it was reasonable or whether it was limited. And I guess through this whole process, we know we're on a journey, and it's set out in the report that there are some areas where we've gained very, very good data. There are some areas where and most of the data has come through from our suppliers, where we have some work to support and encourage our suppliers to improve the quality of their data. And it's in those areas where Toitu have come back and said that, look, they can only provide a limited level of assurance. Now, that's not, I would suggest that's not across that whole category, but just some of the suppliers' information. So it's, they're measuring it by the lowest standards. Some of the suppliers' information within that category is need some work. To provide a generalized summary of what our where our emissions come from, to a very, very large extent, our emissions comes from the consumption of fossil fuels. That's the really simplistic way to look at the bulk of our emissions. And you can see that here in terms of transportation and work-related services. So work-related, that's using diggers and so forth, tractors. You've got transport fuel, you've got commuting to work, embodied emissions in capital construction materials. So that's the Stead Street project that we have. That's concrete and the consumption or use of concrete and steel, and the production of that concrete and steel has been the consumption of fuels.
Can I ask a question about an employee commuting to work? Why would you include that in your essay if we're not going to, as I was mentioning before, include the activities on lease land? Why would you include?
The basis of this, Robert, is it's coming from carbon neutral. What's it called? The carbon neutral project, governance project. And so that's the basis, as well as that's informed from ISO standards and MFA. So that's the methodology that we've applied, and that's what they are doing. Yes.
Neil, are you happy to take questions as we go through?
Yeah, I am actually. Rather do that.
Right, Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. It's an interesting thing. So I see you work some construction, it's a large part of it, and that'll be outside contractors. Do we encompass what what we're saying, we encompass the staff travelling to and from work, councils, whatever, and the contractors under that umbrella.
Yes.
But then do we get to a point that we say that you have to start to account for your own emissions to our contractors? How's that going to work in time? Because this is what larger entities are doing, getting everything under the umbrella and then starting to buy.
Yeah, so for us, in terms of within our organisational and reporting boundary, if we have initiated that piece of work and we've had an emission source through an activity for something that we've asked for and required, then that will come within our boundary, and we'll account for it. The challenge, as you say, is then when you then look at our suppliers, and we're encouraging, and we've saying it in the report that we suggest that we use our influence to encourage suppliers to be on the same journey and to account for their emissions, and they should. Then when you start to aggregate stuff up, then you have to have an offset in terms of we've got it within ours because we initiated it, but they've got it within theirs, but at a regional level, there has to be some offset between the parts.
And so that may narrow up our obligations or the size of what we emit anyway, once we get our outside contractors in time working and getting to know their own levels. I suspect, because all this is evolving, but I suspect that if we are contracting them to do work on our behalf, then it will always sit within our boundary. Because this is a reporting boundary. This is, what we have, what we've initiated, what we're responsible for. And there's a conversation with them about, and we would ideally be wanting them to be more effective and efficient at doing the work and reducing their greenhouse gases as well. So, that they have to own that, and there's conversations there. When they do that, then obviously that's going to have a flow-on impact to us in terms of they're more effective and efficient, and our procurement will be trying to influence and encourage that. But yeah, you're right. We've all got our individual boundaries, and there is some overlap. When you look to consolidate up, that's when you take that overlap out.
Will Fonterra use the same model? Are they claiming responsibility for emissions from the farms that they have to have in order to exist?
Yeah, I can't speak for Fonterra, but so this is, as I say, this is the ISO approach and informed by MFA. So I would envisage, and it is all in development, but I would envisage there's reasonably consistency across the country with the approaches.
Councillors, please indicate to me if you want to ask a question first, so everybody can line them up. Nicole?
Yes. Are you able to sort of compartmentalise excellence? So you get a flood and there's a whole lot of extra stuff. Work for baseline for stuff you do all the time. But somehow we probably need to be able to account for that extra stuff. There's pretty something like this. But it isn't your day-to-day stuff.
Yeah, so that's we have done that, Nicole. And so that's why, and I'm just going back to the earlier screen. So we've got our business as usual, and we've separated that from our capital and extraordinary projects. And there's a couple of reasons for that. As I say, I think one, capital and extraordinary projects are lumpy in terms of size and timing. So that's reason for me, a reason to separate that out, because that, we wouldn't want to report that there's been a reduction in our footprint when it's only the fact that we've reduced or delayed some capital projects, and then all of a sudden it comes in a subsequent year. So I think this gives us a much better visibility over what's really going on. But also from a production management perspective, I think there's a different approach to be taken to the business as usual activity than there is to the capital and extraordinary project activity. The business as usual is day in, day out, every day. Let's affect changes to our emission sources and our emission activity just to reduce that. And ideally, you'll see that sort of tracking down. The capital and extraordinary projects, the conversation might be when those projects are put on the table that actually, it should be when they're being scoped, that there's a consideration around the emissions at that point in time. And they might be managed a bit more so upfront rather than sort of day to day.
You're right, and you're right. If there's a flood situation, ideally, and if it's a big one, then ideally that would be separated out as well, because that's unavoidable.
Okay, thanks.
So what I wanted to do is, and just know, I think expecting that there might be some questions. We haven't got a presentation on this, but I just wanted to walk through the report. If anyone's got any questions, and maybe we just sort of flick through the pages, and if anyone's got any questions relating to a specific page, if that can be asked, does that work, Morris?
Okay, thanks.
So I'm just thinking in terms of maybe the first, so the executive summary, pages 3 and 4, if there's any questions.
Okay, so
So
we're
it's page 15 of the agenda.
Oh, sorry. Questions on?
well, I was going to I'm not sure if Robert asked this before, but it relates to our lease lands. You might have, and I did talk to Rachel about this, and Robert brought it up at a strategy and policy meeting just before. And why are we not including the methane emissions from the stock that are farmed on ES land?
Yes.
You do say that if it's not something that's in our control, we can't do it, but in some ways we do have that control. And over time, I expect that we will be planting more of these lands in trees to get a carbon credit. So it seems to me that we should include them at this early stage, so we can see the changes and improvements that and those farmers are all required, those leaseholders are all required to do an overseer budget. Whether they've all done them or not, I'm not sure. Certainly the ones over 20 hectares should, and overseer will give you that, as you know, will give you that carbon footprint.
So the reason why it hasn't been included is because of our defined boundaries. So on page 7 of my report and
16.
Sorry.
Right.
So where I've 20. So where I've set out the defined boundaries. So and I guess the line has to be drawn somewhere. We've done this work in conjunction with the other local government agencies, with SDC, ICC, and what have you, and said, look, let's define what our organisational boundary is. And the decision that we made is that we will use and there are options. We can use control or a financial control lever or category. We've gone for an operational control requirement. So if we had operational control, then we would look to bring them in. But then we further define operational control to say that we have the ability or the greatest ability to influence their policy, being like their environmental policy, health and safety policy, and such like. So we felt in compiling this that we didn't have that level of control over those organisations. We aren't at that level. We're at a higher level. So for that reason, we've precluded them from being within the organisational boundary. That said, and it is again within the report, we are saying that we should be looking to use our influence on suppliers and or in that regard customers to take self-responsibility and to do their reporting and to be doing the right things as well. So it's not to say that we are ignoring it, but it doesn't fit within our organisational boundary, and we will try and influence those that are outside of our boundary to do the right thing.
Okay, I'd like to follow that up, but Robert's got a question.
Follow up. I understand what you're saying, and I see that we need to set boundaries, but I think that that view is underplaying the potential for that land. And when we think about the regional forum, and we think about iwi and their desire for land use change, particularly around floodplains or into wetlands or into trees, I feel this is our huge opportunity. It's not just a matter of can we influence those people using that land to farm better. there's this whole other thing which we talked about a lot, seems like a massive potential for the council. And this would be a huge step forward in bringing that on a lot faster. And the potential for us to drop back our numbers through that kind of action. I think we're skimming over it. Well, that's why I'm making a fuss about it, because I think we're skimming over it. I hope that others might recognise the potential here.
Yeah,
and
so
more discussion.
Yeah, so sorry, I absolutely agree with you in terms of, so here's our baseline, what sits within our organisation boundary. The step in the journey for us is to do the reduction work. And, you know, the reduction process, and we'll jump ahead a little bit here, but is, you know, the emphasis is to reduce before we offset. However, offset is going to be one of those things that we will have to do in order to meet our net zero 2050. And agree with you, that land is quite probable the area that we would look to do to transition that land to achieve that offset. So I agree with you. Again, we haven't got it within the boundary, but it's not that we're ignoring the opportunities that exist with that land.
I'll just kind of pick that one. We're between the rock and the hard place. You know, our greatest exposure to this is keeping people safe. We've just got to do this operational work. So our option really is mitigation by offset, surely. And I don't know where we need to sort of acknowledge that somewhere in here, that and what that potential is.
Because you know, extending a little bit further, you know, that land was acquired under the Public Works Act, and it was for flood protection. So, you know, that's its primary purpose first and foremost, or, you know, flood management. So that's its primary purpose first and foremost, and then, you know, so there's a different conversation that has to be taking place as to what are the opportunities in that space.
Right, thank you, Neil. I appreciate your knowledge of the council and its processes, because you were previously employed here, and so you know those well. So I think that that sort of satisfies me.
Yeah, can I just perhaps add an additional point or two? So we, as you're aware, have a leasehold land project in the wings, and Hull, I believe we've got a workshop with council next month on that particular project, and there are strong interlinkages here between the two strands of work. So.
Yeah, so there's a proposed, I don't know the exact date, but it's in November workshop, and that undoubtedly the offset conversation or the potential should really be part of the broader conversation that would be the lease land conversations.
Peter.
You just quickly, Mr. Chairman, just on some clarification. So you believe that operational umbrella, or what's the word?
Organisational boundary?
Yes, that's the word, organisational boundary. You believe that the emissions regarding lease land sit with the operation, not with the landowner. That's quite clear on that at this stage.
Yes,
that's the way.
Yes. And again, that has been verified too through Claudius.
So you can reconcile that question with the question of not pushing obligations onto the contractors we use. So those two things can be reconciled to have some fairness into it. I'm just trying to explain things, get things clear in my own head.
Yep.
That we can sit here and say that our contractors that we use, we can absorb your obligations, but we cannot do that with our leasees of our land. Is there a line that we can draw quite clearly?
Yeah. So, you know, if we go back to the principle of control, you know, if we are engaging contractors, then we do have the ability to control, at a lower level, their health and safety and what have you, and we do. You know, whereas we don't at this point in time.
That much control over our leasees.
Yeah, but look, I accept that there's there's, I wouldn't say it's grey, but there are arguments, but that's where the line's been drawn.
Thank you very much for that.
I mean,
we do have control over it.
Ultimately,
Yeah,
at higher level, but not
we actually make some pretty big change. We don't have to, we
we do have ultimate control. And from a point of looking at the lease land, we have developed that land, we have increased the stocking capacity, we've increased the emissions on that land, and we've drawn money off it too. So there is a point of, I believe there's a responsibility that we should be bringing in, facing the fact that we've probably done things on that land we probably shouldn't have done. Because it was floodplains land. So this is for 30 years of developing. So I'm not saying I understand where you're going from, but we do. It's a bit like saying, oh, we got that bit out there, we're not worried about that. Someone else's problem. But we're actually drawing money on it. So it's funding us in a way. So I think it's really important. It should be in this system. We should understand. If I can, it's sort of teasing it out of it, saying the history of it too.
Eric?
It's just a question. I mean, are there any caveats on the Waituna land that we, have some sort of management role in? And given the report in a previous meeting this morning about the effect of native plantings, it would occur to me that there's huge potential for us to do something in that land that's been acquired in Waituna, and in partnership with our other friends that are involved there.
Phil?
Yeah, these are all interesting discussions, but I think it's really important to focus on the fact that this is about measuring our baseline. And there's a bunch of discussion yet to come around. And so what are we going to do about this to move to a far more carbon neutral situation? And we all have a lot of choices, a lot of options we can make around to what degree do we start to exercise greater levels of control over whether it's our contractors, do we insist on only carbon zero contractors being employed to do work for us? Do we change the arrangements with respect to our leaseholders on lease land or different uses of that land? But that to me is part of the subsequent conversation that's going to follow from this. And I don't think we want to get too bogged down in that detail today as we are talking about understanding our baseline. I mean, right now, I appreciate that it's probably inappropriate to go to those farmers who are leasing that land and ask them, how far do your workers commute each day? How do they commute? What vehicles they drive? I suspect we're probably crossing some privacy line when we start asking those questions. In the future, you could say, if we're going to lease it, we insist that you only employ people who commute within 20 kilometres of your, these are the sort of controls you could potentially consider imposing if that was appropriate. But I think that's clearly part of the discussion that will follow once we've started to lock in and understand our baseline for future decisions.
Thank you, Phil. That's very helpful. Lyndall.
Thanks, Chairman. Just two things for me. Follows nicely from Phil, actually. The important thing for me is that the baseline assessment has followed, has been peer reviewed, and it's followed acceptable protocols, given that this is a whole new space and there aren't many. So that reassurance is what we need is at this baseline point. And a question, just in comparison to other entities of similar size, I'd be interested in how we stack up with that.
Yeah, we haven't done those sorts of comparisons because it's very difficult because everyone's work requirements is very different. We do know, and obviously it's part of public domain. I think it's ICC and SDC, their reports, and again, their businesses are quite different, but I think they were circa 15,000 tonnes and 17,000 tonnes. So that gives you some context.
Just
their operating requirements are obviously different than ours.
As time goes forward, I guess we'll get more. Thanks, Chairman.
Thanks, Phil. And Nicole.
Yes, just following on from that conversation, I think we did start this off, so we're walking the walk, and we don't want to double account the lease land in the long term. Rather than going out there in the short term and saying, well, you can't have that worker going there and his vehicle's too hungry. We are going to run into some battles. I think we do consistently what other entities are doing at the moment. And once we've established our credentials, because everybody's going to have to be doing this accounting eventually, and it might work in a report or not. So this farm is using overseer have calculated this, so we're aware of it, so that if we take out some land, we can measure the reduction rather than going a bit small at this stage.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole, and thanks everybody for that contribution. Anybody else got anything to say on that particular topic? Okay, it certainly clarified it for me, so thanks, Neil. Anything else?
You, I just wonder, working through our time, are there other questions relating to the report, or should we move on? Do you still want to go through page by page, or anyone just fire any questions that are in the report?
So it's in your hands now, Neil.
But yeah, so you want to, so there's probably maybe one thing that I'll add just out of the report, and it's just for clarification, and it's page 15 of my report, which is 27 of your report, and just really a bit of clarification of how this thing works. As I mentioned earlier on, it's largely measuring fossil fuels. You're aware that we have a wood fire boiler that we have as well. As far as how the impact that has on the baseline is, the carbon dioxide from the wood is not recorded within our boundary, because within our organisational boundary, and that's because, you know, the tree, when it grew, it sequestered carbon. Then when we burnt it, that carbon got released. So this here takes 100-year lens of things, so that carbon dioxide's not recorded. However, the methane and the nitrous that comes from burning wood is recorded. So you'll see at the top of that page 15, direct emission in tonnes of CO2 from biomass. That is the carbon dioxide that is a result of us using that wood fire boiler.
Yes, Peter.
Just a question pertaining to that.
Yeah.
So the council's involved with a large amount of collaborative projects of planting and re-establishing native vegetation. Can we use that at all? If it's on the negative side, you're talking about burning wood, and in a normal situation, that's fine as long as you're replanting forests. So as we get down the track, and I know Phil's right when he talked about this is what we have right now, and I'm just talking about in the future, what abilities do we have to try and share some benefits from the farming programs that we do and partake in all around the
Yeah, so the shared, I'll park that part of the question for now, if you don't mind. But in terms of so within the page 16 of the report, our category 1.5,
Page 28.
forestry natural, which is essentially what you're talking about. So council already has some natural forestry, and there are CO2 removals as a result of those of having forestry. And it is taken on the age of the trees and what have you. So there is a certain amount of removal per hectare for the first 30 years, and then it goes into a slightly maturing from 30 to 100, and then over 100 there's deemed not to be any further removals. So council has benefited from some of that land that they own at the moment. There are some reasonably specific criteria around the size of that forest, in terms of it's got to be, from memory, a minimum of a hectare and a minimum of to be more than 30 metres wide and what have you. So there are some certain criteria that MFE and what have you have put around it. But you know, that's we are benefiting from it. I think it's about 189 tonnes of offset that we've got from natural forest.
What about in terms of some of our projects, like our jobs for nature work, environmental enhancement fund?
It's going to need to meet that criteria. which is, you know, the width, the hectares and the maximum height of the trees and what have you. So there is some specific criteria, but if it did, and I get then a question around the apportionment of ownership of it in terms of, you know, how that might happen, which is, you know, was the other part of your question in terms of, you know, our involvement in that with other parties as to who then, you know, how you divvy up the benefit as a result of it. You know, I guess it's, you know, it's going to have to meet our organisational boundary criteria to be deemed within our boundary. You know, some of that stuff we may struggle with in terms of meeting that boundary criteria. I will talk. Join the limelight. I'll talk about planted forests, because we do have some or managed forestry. And so there are two ways to handle accounting for inclusion of a managed forest. One is that we plant a section of land, and then every year we have an element of removal. Then we harvest the land or harvest the trees, and then all of a sudden we get this massive emission. And then you replant them, you get removal. So that's one way of handling it. The other way of handling it is that when you do land use change and you've taken a piece of land, like maybe leased land, and you've put trees on it, and you plant out, whether forest or forest, say, managed forest, and then you get removal up to its first rotation when it gets harvested, and then you get no benefit from it thereafter, because it's just so what happens in that situation is you don't get this is the term penalised for the emissions when you harvest, because it's knowing that you're going to replant it and it's going to continue. You only bring it into your baseline when you have land use change. That's the approach that we took, and the rationale being around our primary purpose for this is to give council transparency over their emissions. And we were concerned that if we took the alternative approach, that maybe we put this report up to you and it might have said half the level of emissions, because you're getting quite a bit of offset from your forestry out there. However, when you harvest that forest, you're going to get hit with a massive emission for all of the sequestered carbon as a result. So you're going to have, report low, massive spike, report low. So we didn't like that from a messaging perspective and from a observation and an ability to manage your footprint perspective. So, you'll see it in again under section 1, our point 1.6, where I talked about managed forest. I said there's different approaches could be taken, but just thought it's worth explaining the approach that we took. So consequently, essentially you're not getting any benefit from the current managed forest that you have, because it's all past its first rotation.
Yes, thank you. Now, I've got a question from Nicole, but Peter, of course, is doing his own reforestation and his own methods, and there's all sorts of things you can do, averaging and all that sort of thing. And so, Peter's a real expert in this area. We know that people that are involved in the industry know that the MPI rules about the area and the all of that sort of stuff is, and also the carbon that is stored by native forests is not at the moment, doesn't represent podocarp forests very well. It's based on Manuka-Carnica forests, and so you only get it for 50 years, and then it assumes that it doesn't accumulate carbon anymore. But podocarp forests, Titra, Matai, Kakatea, continue to absorb carbon for hundreds of years.
Yes.
So that's not something we can do anything about yet, but hopefully in the future that will be recognised.
Yes.
Sorry about that, we spelled, Nicole.
Well, just following on from your conversation about possibly even shared credits. I mean, we did the poplar planting on the Arete. Well, probably other things will block that initiative was actually sequestering carbon. Is there a way of sharing that?
So it really does come back to we've got to go back to our base principles of the organisational boundary, and whether or not we have ownership or based on principles, whether that should be included within ours. And you know, I don't know the answer specifically because I don't know the situation, but you know, we have covered in here when there's, and it's the sort of the flip side of that, but when there's shared procurement, like there's us and there are other funders of procurement. So what we've said in that situation is that if they're all involved in the decision-making process, i.e., you know, choosing, you know, who is going to provide the service, then we should all be sharing the emissions relative to our contribution, because we're able to influence the decisions and what have you. However, if the funding is really just as a grant or whatever, and there's no control over that, then the ownership should sit elsewhere. So there's perhaps a, you know, and I haven't considered it, but there's perhaps a similar approach that could be applied to your situation in terms of the allocation of it. So you say, I think the conversation regarding that.
The principles are on page 36 of the agenda, and those were ones that we worked through with our local authority partners. So that, because we're quite often in a situation where we're doing procurement sharing with our partner agencies, and so took the approach of what would make sense in terms of how you would be splitting those emissions. And so I guess that's a point that would be taken away is how would you then take the next step and think about what a sharing arrangement might be when you're talking about reducing emissions. So yeah, it's challenging.
That we flows on to people out in the community, encourages the third party. A lot of cases, the land that's been planted on, whether it's beside a stream, is actually owned by lot. But again, to incentivize people to be doing it and looking after plants, it just follows that shared.
Yeah. So some of the challenges, and back to what Morris was talking about earlier, some of the challenges to that, Nickel, relate to MFE's rules around what they will include within, will allow you to include within your boundary, and that's must be 30 metres wide. There must be, you know, grow to a maximum or a minimum of X height, and must be greater than hectare. So some of those rules will preclude some of, you know, some plantings. So, you know, but hopefully at the moment, and that's exactly right. Hopefully, things catch up. Yeah.
Right, thank you. Yes, it is complex. Do you want to talk about the independent audit opinion? Are we up to that now? Yes.
Well, so we sort of covered that off briefly. You know, they've given us the assurance of reasonable and limited, and as I sort of stated earlier, limited is it's not completely within those categories, but it's within some of the supply of information within those categories is of you know, opportunities for improvement. So you know, so we've had to derive the numbers more so than being given specific numbers, but you know, I think, I suppose, talking off the cuff, I think the audit went very well though, and I think we've shared everything that we got back from the auditors with you in terms of including their report, and you'll see that there were only very, very minor amendments and recommendations that they picked up. So, you know, I think council's in a, you know, the work that we did was at a, I'd suggest at a very high level, and we've got very good oversight over what are the opportunities for improvement going forward for improving data, as well as starting to work on our reduction strategies.
Probably the additional point to make here is that going through the verification process was part of the learning curve as an organisation, in terms of needing to come to a place or hoping to come to a place where we could have a level of confidence in the baseline figures that that Neil's worked on for us. And so I think we're, by having this verification, we're definitely in a place of like, yes, this is a good place to be. Though in saying that, because of the assurance direction and the comments made in the report and the conversations we've had about data quality, the organisational baseline by nature will tend to move a little bit within the, especially from my understanding from other organisations within the first few years of being set. So while we have a baseline now being put forward to the subcommittee today, as those improvements get made over the coming years, that we may be in a situation that may retrospectively tweak this baseline slightly to make sure that when you're comparing across years, you're comparing exactly the same methodology and quality as possible. So there's always that nature.
Yeah, and to add to that, so we were fortunate, I guess, when we first did the baseline, we're using the 2002 emissions factors that MFE had put out, but just prior to completing it, they put out their 2023. So we used the 2022 initially, but then they put out the 2023. So then we updated the emissions factors. So even by that, in terms of MFE getting more precise about the information in their emissions factors, that took about 30 tonnes off your baseline. So, you know, that's sort of what's happening in terms of, you know, they're getting better and better, their science is getting better and better and more accurate. So there's things like that are happening. So, you know, but we've used the latest. So, you know, consequently, when, you know, next year, if they put out a new baseline, we might reset the emissions factors to that so that we know that we're comparing apples with apples.
So you're confident that the items that are listed as a limited level of assurance can get to a reasonable level of assurance at some stage?
Yes, that's based upon suppliers' data.
Yeah.
So, you know, and as I sort of suggest, I think within under that, there are some suppliers that are very, very good. You know, we're very fortunate. Some of our big suppliers are very much on this journey, but then there are others that, you know, will need a bit of a helping hand. And so that's, you know, and as I say, I think in the detail that we've gone through in this process, we know who those suppliers are. So, you know, we write a list and then start on that journey in terms of having those conversations with those suppliers.
Okay, thanks. Anything else?
Thanks very much, because it's actually quite a significant piece of work, and it's in local government terms, it's happened quite quickly. So well done. And of course, the next question is what now? As far as what really are the next steps for this subcommittee?
Yes.
So the last time we presented on this was via a council workshop where we talked through the methodology and everything was quite conceptual still because we didn't have the final figures. Now we're in a situation where we have got the baseline figures, and so we wanted to take the opportunity today really of making sure that the Climate Change Subcommittee has got a really good understanding of how that report has come about, and I think we're done pretty well on that in the last half an hour or so with Neil's direction on that. But yes, there is a lot of discussion already happening about next steps. And so we've been in the background trying to work through what they could be. And where we've got to in terms of emissions reductions is that really we want to start with a principled approach and make sure that we've got some really clear idea about some of the things that we need to be focusing on. So we'll talk through some proposed draft guiding principles as part of the rest of the presentation, but that's set in the context of there is quite a bit of ongoing research internally going on in terms of what are the emissions reductions opportunities, how do we set those interim targets, how do we develop those pathways, talking with our partner agencies, what have they done, what can we learn from them, what can we do together, and so lots of those conversations happening so that hopefully we can progress this conversation. It won't be all progressed today. It'll be this will be the start of a conversation that will have to take place over potentially a series of climate change subcommittee meetings and then propose their strategy and policy as well. So that's the context. And also the last point on that slide too, ongoing measurement of these emissions. The proposal is that we do this annually. I think it's really important that we keep track of this now that we've done it once, but it will give us more meaning and more ability to connect in with it as an organisation if we're able to do this annually. And so that's something that we are hoping to hold together in terms of an ongoing business case as well. So these are the principles as a whole, and I've got them all individually on a slide to go through one by one, but the point to make here in terms of where we've got to with this is that there's not specifically a hierarchy with these principles, but that they need to be read together and interpreted together, and hopefully with the direction input from the committee today that we get to a place where we go, okay, this is a good starting point, hopefully, that we can then start applying towards developing an emissions reduction pathway. So the first one we've got there is essentially what is in the short term, in a nutshell, reduce before offset, but we've fleshed that out a little bit more to say remove, reconsider, reduce as much as possible before considering offset. So if we're going to develop an emissions reduction pathway, the remove and reconsider words are in there to first, so that we can think through, pause, do we actually need whatever it is that we're trying to do, this particular activity or this particular resource, and sometimes that remove gets forgotten or glossed over when we're talking about reductions. So we specifically thought that we should include it here, and reconsider as well as after if you do need to have whatever it is, reconsider is about, okay, can we just first look at the alternatives and make sure we work through those, and then that's all wrapped up into a reduction conversation that ideally, when we're talking about our baseline and looking for opportunities, we want to try and reduce our emissions essentially as the first priority before we work down the conversation of offset. In reality, we may have to go down the track of offset very much in the short term at the very least, because we won't be able to reduce all in one go. So it's going to be a journey, but essentially that's where we've got to in terms of establishing a first principle. I'm not quite sure I think the best thing would probably be to step through all of these principles, and then we can discuss them as a whole so that we don't get hung up on one particular one. But if there's any burning questions, then pitch in.
Okay, anybody got any questions about that? Okay, no, seems to be good.
So the second one, I'll hand over to Neil to discuss this in detail. It's a little bit technical, this one.
So it's really important to understand that formula. Emission sources times that source of activity times the emission factor. And the reason why I think that's important is because that's how all this accounting is done. It's those three elements is multiplied by to give you your emissions, your total emissions. But that to us then, what are the two levers at our disposal? Like the emission factor, we can maybe change that by trying to influence MFE, but so I'll park that. But the emission source and the emission activity are fundamentally our two levers that we have to reducing our emissions. And so to put that in some context, so emission source, if we buy a hybrid or even electric vehicle as opposed to a ute, that's changing the emission source. So using that vehicle is all immediately going to have an impact on our total emissions. However, there's the other lever, which is actually if we can reduce the amount of usage that we have of that vehicle, regardless of what its emission, regardless of what fuel system it has, then we're also having a benefit on our emission factor. So I think it's really, really important to look at those as being independent levers and have different strategies around each, rather than just saying, oh, we want to reduce emissions, because that's gives us better insight into what's going on to do the calculation.
And in terms of organisational learning, especially when you're looking at source activity, they're definitely in the realm of talking about behavioural change and things as well. And so that's where investing some time and energy into that, I think, is where you're playing a long-term game. And that change takes time to take place.
I think if I may say something slightly controversial, I think that equivalent, that equation is something that our national politicians should probably try to understand as well.
Sorry. Who's going to comment to that?
Well, and then I've got an electric car, but it takes a lot of energy to make that. And if the more that you've got, you've still got to consider that.
So the point of the second principle is really that we want to look at both of those aspects to that equation. I think to get most bang for buck.
There's two levers.
Yeah.
Oh, look, I'll just pick up on that last question that you had about offsets. You see offsets as a short-term mechanism to get us to where we want to go. It's not an ongoing, reliable source of get out of jail type free type of thing. So how do we view that? And I'm sorry about all these questions. We're learning too as we go.
That was the whole point. But
Yeah.
sorry.
It does depend to some degree as to what kind of interim targets we set and how fast and how hard we want to go as a council on this. And so I guess with both of those levers in terms of reduction as well as offset, you've got so much you can do with reduction. That might be some low-hanging fruit that might be able to take quick action, but I'm not sure if, depending on what target we set, whether that's going to be enough to reach a particular target without offset in the short term. Whereas you're potentially going to be able to build that capability into a longer term time frame.
Yeah, so we're not just going to put stuff in a box and forget about it. We will have a calculation beside the offsets of reduction over time to.
Sorry, offset, so just for clarification, so offset fundamentally means planting trees.
Yes.
So it's, there's going to be, we'll do reduction and continue to do reduction as best as we can to reduce our emissions. We've still got work to do. We're never going to get it to zero. So then we look to, okay, we've got to offset by planting trees. Now, well, yeah. Trees, according to this, unfortunately. No, they don't. They don't meet the requirement of MFE. But so that's a work on. But so in terms of the offset, if it was a managed forest and we did a land use change and took some leasehold land and planted a managed forest on it, then we will get an offset for the 26 or 7 years, whatever it is, before that's then harvested. If we put a natural forest in there, then we'll get an offset for 100 years until it's deemed that it no longer exists.
Really, I suppose, is as long as we don't just put it all into a forest, put it in a box and walk away and say nothing to see here, because we've got this, what the district council with their forestry assets could most probably do that, say nothing to see here, we're all good. But that's not really the way we should be doing it. We should have a calculation of reduction alongside those offsets, so in time we can learn how to tackle stuff. It just buys us time to start to do the hard stuff. That's my view anyway.
Yeah, and that's pretty much what's trying to be captured as well by that first principle too.
Yeah, because we're saying do reduction first and foremost. Exactly what you're saying. Reduction first and foremost. Yeah. Don't just pop out and plant more trees and think, nothing to see here. So do reduction, and then with whatever you've got left over, residual that you can't reduce, then plant trees.
Thank you, Peter. I've got Robert and Eric, but I've also just been reminded that our next meeting starts at 1 o'clock. So we just need to try and wrap this up within the next few minutes, we can, Robert.
Because surely this management, and I see just about this a lot, factoring in what's being lost as a result of safety.
I guess I'm using that term and consistent with what MFE used, managed treating. It's a forest that you're harvesting. You're going to harvest in every month. That's how I'm using the term.
Eric?
Yeah, I was thinking your last response to the wetlands has stimulated a question, which is a very broad brush approach to offsets, the hectare, Yes. If I've got a thing in my tractor that measures GPS accurate to less than 2 centimetres, there has to be a better way of doing this. And what sort of activity is taking place with FME to say, get real? And if you want to engage with people, you need to provide more options than the blunt tool that you've got.
Yep.
Right, thank you. Anything else? You've got some more slides there.
Yeah, just to work through the last three principles. The third one is one that Neil was also going to talk us through.
So very quickly, I've spoken to this already in terms of the distinction between capital extraordinary projects and BAU. Consideration is BAU will have a different management strategy, and the capital and extraordinary projects the management strategy will largely, ideally, be at the front end when the project is being scoped. Consideration over the full life cycles emissions for any new initiatives or projects that are undertaken.
Just, Chairman, the extraordinary projects would cover things like emergency works after a flood or.
Yeah, for this report, we've included the Underia removal as an extraordinary project.
The fourth principle we've got there is consider practical organisational learning opportunities, such as trial of pilot reduction options. And this is actually something that came out of a conversation we had at our with our partner agencies when we are having these regular meetings, where one of the other agencies said a really good way to start, because it can be quite full on to try and how do you tackle this as a whole, is to look for those opportunities to take a bite-sized approach and really make sure you do that well, get the learning from that, and then look at applying that learning across to other parts of the organisation. And this resonated internally here, so putting this forward as a principle. And one of the examples, just to provide as an example, is potentially the Environment Southland Awards that are going to be held next week. If, for example, we created a specific baseline for that particular event and measured it and went through that process, and then we could create a specific target for that event, and then we'll go through the learning. There's a chunk of our organisation that's significantly involved in the organisation of that event, so it's another part of our organisation that would be learning how to go about it. And so the opportunity is also there to be bold for something small scale and achievable, and that will also contribute to organisational learning. And the last principle is consider potential opportunities to align and collaborate with partner agencies. And so this one is this one's ongoing really, and it kind of picks up on some of the questions that were being asked in the committee meeting this morning too, and the fact that while this is a really existing work in progress, I think this is quite key to improving things over the long term, not only in terms of measurement, but also in terms of emissions reduction, that there are potentially ways we can be efficient or look for ideas or learn from each other and align across particularly our partner agencies, but probably also with the community here too. So that's essentially where what the background is for proposing this last principle. Reading those principles as a whole, that's essentially, quite keen to get some feedback from the subcommittee today and input into it. And the idea would be that they would then be recommended to Strategy and Policy Committee for approval if this is a goer. But yeah, keen to first hear the input from the subcommittee in terms of whether this is a good enough starting point to get us underway in terms of an emissions reduction pathway for our organisation.
For you, Chair, if you wanted to take a bit more time to consider that, we can bring these back to another climate change subcommittee next month too. We've got some dates in the wings, but the original idea was to consider them today and take up to the next stream.
Maybe Uncle, you could send out a questionnaire or something based on that to us, rather than come up with I don't think it was possible to deal with that well enough today.
Yeah.
Would that be like you've done before, and we can respond with two specific things that you're asking about?
And there were a couple of potential dates for subcommittee meeting. One was the 16th of November and one was the 29th of November. So they're the 16th of November one's coming up quite soon if you wanted to do it in such a way that there was a questionnaire and then we progress the discussion via the subcommittee meeting still, then there could be an option as well.
Does that sound all right?
Is it really necessary, Chairman? I mean, they're pretty good principles. As a starting point, there might be a few tweaks that we could add, but I'm not sure whether how councillors feel about, we need to
Or maybe
spend
we,
another hour, I'm not sure.
we don't, well, we can't do that now, but
No.
well, I was thinking that if, give people the opportunity, there may not be anything you want to say about them. But if we definitely have that meeting in November, then we'll be able to finalise it then, surely.
Just before the meeting, send them out. at home. And whoever wants to contribute, they can.
Well, we've got some recommendations, which we do need to agree to today. And these are on, back at the beginning on page 9 of our agenda, which address all of these things we've been talking about today. So we'll move with those. Is there anybody that wanted to say anything specific about those? Because there's a list of 5 specific things there which we have been talking about today, but it seems to cover everything. Is there anything else that is missing? No.
Could I just say, Mr. Chairman, that this is all a learning experience for all of us in this room. This is also new, and that's why the questions you may have got a bit frustrating with that organisational profile that you're talking about, but we're just searching for information ourselves and learning. It's really valuable.
So, I'd say that's how I wrote the report. It's to inform, because again, we're all learning, so I was, it's probably a bit more detailed and operational than you might normally see, but it's like, it's
Got to be
set it out and let's have these conversations.
Do we need to, well, second, thank you, Nicole. Do we need to add something to that about getting further feedback, or is that we need to do that?
So at this stage, the recommendation goes that these go through to Strat and poll. So we could send the survey out in between times, and you've got the opportunity to make the changes at the committee. Yeah.
Okay, so we don't need to have anything.
I don't think so.
Right, so we've got a mover and a seconder. Anybody else want to say anything? Anybody at all? Okay, all those in favour then, please say aye. Aye. It's carried. And thank you very much, Anka and Neil. It's been a very interesting discussion at this start of our journey. So we've got something to go on now.
You have benefited greatly from his previous project. His attention to detail has definitely been something that I've appreciated working alongside Neil on that basis too.
I hope I haven't crossed the line in any way. I suspect on my head, but
So I'm sorry to be pathetic, but there's just 2 other items: extraordinary business. I don't think there's any of that, and there's no public excluded business. So with that, I'll declare the meeting closed.
Yeah. Right time.
Neil, when you say across the line, you mean your organisational boundary? Yeah.